All right, the final chapter of the textbook. We all thought this day would never come, right? Well, here we are. So it's a pretty simple chapter. It's actually much more fun to cover this topic in person because it's about critique. Uh, and ideally, this most recent artwork that you guys were working on, we would tie into this chapter by critiquing your art. But a lot of you haven't done the art, so there's not much to critique at this point. And obviously, if you're in person, then I'm more able to make sure everyone's doing their art, but whatever. So let's go through this worksheet. Number one, what do you think is the purpose of critique? So there's a bunch of notes that I wrote on the first few slides, and then we'll get to looking at some art here later. So purpose of critique: an examination to determine how successful the art is at achieving its goals. It provides a conversation about how and why an artwork was conceived and created, and allows the artist to hear feedback and interpretation. So in a lot of ways, critique, I guess in a high school setting, is partially about the improvements that you can make as an artist, in order to grow with the way that you produce art, with your technique and your skills. The first couple of years of college art was kind of like that, when you're in drawing 1, drawing 2. Eventually you get it into the third and fourth year type of stuff, and everyone's really good by then, and people don't really make those small mistakes anymore, and they're mainly the people that are dedicated to their art. So suddenly at that level, at a more advanced level and a professional level, it's less about saying, oh, you drew this one thing bad, you could have drawn that a little better. And it just becomes purely about the message. It's like, okay, everyone here is pretty good at drawing and painting. Let's not worry about the technique. Let's worry about the meaning. Does it convey the meaning that it was intended to convey? So for the most part, we try to have critique be more about the message rather than the quality of the art. All right, number 2, tips for critique. Says use critique as a way to learn how to see. So if you're not real good at critique or understanding art as a whole, you kind of look at something and you're like, oh, that person's a good painter, oh, that's a good drawing, but you're not really dialing in and learning how to see the whole picture. It's kind of like someone that's I'm going to use a music metaphor. If you don't have an understanding of music theory, or you've never been a musician, then when you listen to a song, you're going to look for different qualities. But if you do know more about music, you're going to appreciate qualities of music that maybe you wouldn't have before. And so, maybe something isn't your favorite kind of music, but since you're a musician, you can still appreciate the quality or the writing or whatever. So that's interesting. All right, be open to new ideas or interpretations, because a lot of times in critique, you're going along and someone gives you a new idea about something or how to interpret, and you're like, oh, cool. Rather than sitting there arguing about it, you should be open about it. A criticism of your artwork is not a criticism of yourself. That's really important. So don't take it personally. It's just business, So sometimes we take things personally, and we need to know that everyone has their own role and their own opinion. And if everyone's taking all the opinions too personally, then no one's going to want to share their opinion. So, if everyone's going to be butthurt immediately, then who would even want to participate in a critique? Because if you're in an environment where you can say something critical in a nice way, then everyone's feels more open and more comfortable. So don't be afraid to say something stupid, basically, and then be descriptive. I like it because not just I like it. So try to be descriptive. All right, moving on. There's some quotes on this slide from the textbook, but it's not one of the questions on our worksheet, so I'll just fly through this. I want the artwork to be viewed with respect. I want to see things from different points of view and hear different interpretations. I want the viewer's first emotional and spontaneous impression. I don't want people to say, oh, I like it, just to be nice and move on. I don't want people to give me tips. That would totally change my point. All right. Number 3 on the worksheet, what perspectives should an artist have concerning self-critique? So this is, judging your own artwork. All right. When you're judging yourself, ultimately, the only person who needs to be happy with your art is you. That's one of the hardest things about an artist or a musician or whatever form of art is like you pour yourself into something and you kind of hope that someone else gets something out of it, but maybe they won't. And ironically, the stuff that you make that you love the most is often not going to be what other people love the most. And so something that you make that you think is weird or boring or not that cool, all of a sudden you're like, find out that everyone likes that, or a lot of people really like it. If you guys were able to have the art shows this year, I regret that you can't, but the reality of year after year, so many kids and so many of our art students will find out that the art that the judges like the most is not the same art that the artists like the most. So it's very interesting how that works. So in the end, you can't really control what other people like. So you just got to make yourself happy. That's the whole point of it, and that's a good life lesson for you. Second thing that says here, you need to take the information that other people give you and make use of it, even if that use is to ignore it. So a lot of you are very good at ignoring advice, but you just have to have like an appropriate filter. I think as you get older and wiser, you're a little more open because you're less insecure, so you're a little more open to advice. You need to have a firm mission. If your mission is to be original or to be a sellout, then go get it. So, as an artist, for me, when I make my visual art, I have a personality where I actually am a sellout. That's like when I draw portraits for people. People, when they want portraits, of course they want them to be as accurate as possible, and I can do that, and I'm pretty good at it. I hate to brag, but my actual enjoyment in art is to make something weird or funny, or something that has like a little bit of a story, or you have to think about it a little bit. So the two personalities of being able to draw portraits really well, like to me, that's boring. That's a sellout, because that's just what the people want. That's why it's a sellout. So I would rather be original. That's what actually is fun for me. But either case, if you want to do one or the other, then go get it. Like, just go for it. 100%, 110%. All right. Lastly, learn your strengths and weaknesses so you can work around your weaknesses and focus on your strengths. Almost anything, and I hope that you guys learned over the years, now that most of your art educations are almost over, but one of the fun parts for me as an art teacher is to try to identify the things that kids are good at and artists are good at, so that I can have those strengths grow. We want the weaknesses to grow a little bit too, but honestly, being a good artist, like, most artists aren't perfect at every single thing. Most artists have a niche, a little thing that they do better than most people, and that once they find that, they stick with it and they hammer on it, and they get really good at that one thing. So it's okay to not be good at everything, and it's kind of my job to help you find that one thing and develop it. All right. I think that part's done. Let's move on to the fun part, looking at art. First work of art that we're looking at is a Van Gogh painting, and you'll notice that on the worksheet I put the three things that we always talk about in every critique: what you like about it, what you'd improve, and then what you think the meaning is. If one thing I'm going to point out in this slideshow is if you look at the art, there's a critique where you don't know the background of the art, and there's a critique where you do. And knowing a little bit of information about the art or the artist has a huge impact on how you perceive the art. So that's such an important thing, and I think in the real art world, if you're an artist that works for a company, maybe like a graphic designer, or if you're just simply a painter that makes art for yourself, or if you're making a painting for someone else, you pretty much don't live in a box as an artist. You always have the outside world that is going to provide influence. So knowing more about art or a painting or whatever, it's going to impact how you critique it. So this one here from Van Gogh. Van Gogh painted this in 1889, 1890 or so. And ironically, this was a wheat field that was outside of a mental asylum. Van Gogh had self-checked him into a mental asylum. He was struggling with mental health for a year or so, throughout his life. But for 1 year, around 1889, he was checked in. He came outside the asylum, painted this picture. It was there's a term in plein air, and I don't know how to say it in French, but it's actually in French. So I kind of butchered that, but it's basically a term that means that you are out painting a landscape where the landscape is at, not from a picture. Obviously, back in the day, 1889, there wouldn't have been too much photography. Virtually no one had a camera at that point. So pretty much any painting from then was either from memory, from imagination, or like right at the spot. And so he painted this right at the spot. And he painted this before Starry Night. The tall trees that are off to the right are cypress trees, and those are a prominent thing that shows up in the painting Starry Night. You can see a lot of the texture and the brush strokes are similar to the way that he painted Starry Night. So it's kind of like a precursor. I had one note on this I want to pass along. A quote from him that he was writing to his brother about this painting. He says, "I have a canvas of cypresses with some ears of wheat, some poppies, a blue sky, like a piece of Scotch plaid. The former painted with a thick impasto like Monticelli's." He goes on, blah, blah, blah. One thing he talks about is how he tried to depict the extreme heat. I don't know if he really succeeded at that. So it's interesting, as good of a painter as he was, he's literally talking about how it was a hot day, and he wanted to depict that. To me, the wheat seems pretty warm, but I don't know, the sky doesn't really seem that warm to me. So if we were in a critique with Vincent van Gogh, we'd kind of be like, yeah, I see what you're doing. You have a lot of really good stuff going here. But when you talk about the idea of heat in this picture, I'm not sure if I really get that same interpretation. So that would be kind of like a critiquey, processy thing that would happen. Next one, number 5, Salvador Dali. I put most of my more favorite artists on here, or at least some of the more famous artists. So I figured if this is basically our last slideshow, I put some of the most famous artists that we've looked at this year. So this is a Dali painting, and at first glance, like, what is going on here? This is a painting that would benefit from having the actual artist. When I tried to do research on this painting, couldn't find much So I actually found mostly other people's interpretation of the painting. So we don't have much from Salvador Dali, but when you look at the painting, first couple things that pops out for me as an artist is the bright colors that are towards the top, and then the bottom of the picture is kind of a depressing muted gray. So there's definitely more colors in the top. And then the other thing is most of the people in the pictures are kind of like transparent, see-through. They're more like forms and not like solid people. So the woman that's standing off to the right, and then was there 4 men that are kind of crouched down on towards the middle and the left. Some of the commentary I read about this picture, people were speculating that it was about work, toil. So this kind of constant struggle that humans have between doing the hard work that needs to be done, and then so that's what the men that are semi-invisible represent, and then the one man that's like the main character that has the white shirt on. So there's hard work, and then there's like an escape, or I guess desires or sin or whatever, however whatever way you'd want to say that. So and then there's the wall that separates the two, and that wall is kind of crumbling there, and the guy is kind of on both sides of that wall. Does that make sense? So it's pretty interesting to look at it that way. So if you just look at the picture, you're like, oh, that's a pretty neat painting, blah, blah, blah. But when you actually start to like dissect some of the interpretations of the picture, you can see some of the decisions that Salvador Dali made. And one interesting thing that no one really knows why, and sometimes Salvador Dali did stuff in his art just to confuse people, just like his sense of humor, where it's like, if I put this in here, people will think that it means something, and it really doesn't. But just like way off in the distance, there's one guy, I assume a guy that's just standing on the sandy dune all the way back there, and so no one really understands why that's there, and maybe it's not there for any reason at all. All right, number 6 on your worksheet, a Picasso painting. This was a painting that Picasso did nearing the end of his life, and it's always interesting for art historians to look at artwork from artists as they were getting older, because their skills start to diminish a little bit. So some of the things that they might have done really well, they struggle with a little bit, just because they can't see that well, can't hold a steady brush, things like that. So one detail about this painting is people observed that he kind of went easy on the background. So there's the white and blue stripes that are on the right side, and they just don't fit with the rest of the picture. So that's unfortunate, but guy's getting older, got to give him some forgiveness. The picture overall is an interesting narrative. Picasso, like a lot of artists in that era, the 60s, the 50s, postmodernism, that stuff. Sorry, my video cut out there, so I had to stop it. But anyway, Picasso was kind of skeptical about love as a postmodernist, and you see this picture here. A lot of people interpret it as the woman seemingly has one eye on her lover or husband. One eye kind of isn't, and then the man's like not looking at her at all, looking off to the distance. So it obviously has this kind of uncomfortable feel. You might say that any art that is a picture or a video or whatever of two people kissing is uncomfortable, but for the sake of what this is, it's like, no, do they even really like each other? So let alone how gruesome and ugly they look. But that's just the style that he had, was Cubism, so everything kind of was more shapy rather than realistic. But anyway, so if you don't have the context of how Picasso paints or painted, if you didn't understand Cubism, if you didn't understand that he was aging, it would kind of change your interpretation, and it would change your critique of this picture. But when you do understand those things, then now you know, and it's going to impact the way that you look at the art. All right, number 7 on your worksheet is a photographer called Gregory Crewdson. This picture here is untitled, but is known as Overturned Bus. So there's a lot of stuff from Crewdson. I'm not actually real familiar with most of his art. There was just one picture that I studied in college, and I used to have it on the slideshow, but I took it off because I was just looking through some of his other art, his other photography, and I was like, oh, there's some examples here that I think my class would get more. This one here, Overturned Bus. So Crewdson's art as a whole, or his photography as a whole, kind of dealt with loneliness a lot of times. Again, postmodernism, it's like, why don't any artists do something like happiness? But whatever. So this is one of the lesser lonely pictures that he has in there. He's displayed in art galleries and stuff. But obviously this one is interesting because it is a photograph. It's not photoshopped. So I wasn't able to find the history on this picture, but they obviously overturned a bus in order to make this scene. So that in and of itself is pretty interesting. And if you can't see the details in the picture, unfortunately, you kind of need a real high resolution version of this to get all the details. But there's kids sitting around the bus, and so I don't know. My first thought is kind of like The Simpsons with the crazy bus driver. If you get any Simpsons reference, there's Otto, the bus driver. So it's like, okay, was this bus driver driving like really crazy and it turned the bus over? But it doesn't seem to make much sense based on the setting. So the metaphor, I think it's a metaphor for basically like anti-education or anti the system. You have one student who is standing on top of the bus. It's kind of like a king of the hill sort of imagery. And then the spectators just kind of gathering around. The bus is smoking. So again, you'd say, oh, it was just an accident. It may be, but to me, I put all the pieces together and I kind of interpret it as anti-system or anti-school. So you might kind of feel that way a little bit right now since you guys are at home with the whole COVID-19. So this might be how you interpret school right now. So this is an example of a critique where we don't have much information. So I can't give you much other than his other photography tends to be about loneliness. All right, almost done. Last page. We have number 8 on the slideshow is Thomas Hart Benton. If you remember, I've talked about him a lot because he's maybe my favorite painter of all time. So he did this landscape called Trail Riders. He was out on a vacation. You can see in the mid-60s, 1964, 1965, and he was actually horseback riding through the Canadian Rockies with a friend. And if you can see towards the bottom middle of the picture, there's 2 horses there, and so there's one up that's towards the right side. So anyway, it's kind of like a autobiographical painting because he's kind of he's exaggerating. You can see that he's not into painting perfectly real. He takes shapes like trees, mountains and stuff, and he kind of bends them, and it's kind of like clay looking, Play-Doh looking, the way that he paints it. So he's not trying to paint perfectly realistic. He's kind of stylizing or idealizing everything. So he's got an interesting style, and that's what I really enjoy about him. So if you're looking at this artwork and you're like, oh, is this person trying to paint like a realistic picture? Well, they failed at that. But when you know that that's kind of the style that he painted everything, kind of all bendy and Play-Doh looking, then you have a different interpretation of it. So hopefully that gives you something to write for number 8. All right, Barbara Kruger, number 9. We've had a lot of Barbara Kruger art this school year. Barbara Kruger did a lot of feminist themes and took a lot of the images that she kind of tied together from magazines. So she'd find pictures in magazines and then put the text or the font over the top of it. So one of the interesting things about Barbara Kruger is that her artwork was complex on purpose. So she didn't necessarily want people to understand what the art was about. If you leave a little bit of a window open for people to fill in their own interpretation, sometimes that's what makes art more broadly appealing. Because if you give your art only one possible outcome, this art is so obvious, this is the only thing it could possibly mean. Well, sometimes a lot of people won't relate to that. So, if you make it a little more vague, then the doors open wider for more people to kind of get something out of it. So we've probably all had a moment in our lives where this phrase, know nothing, believe anything, forget everything. We've probably all had moments in our lives where you look at someone or a group of people or whatever, and this phrase would work perfectly based on how they're behaving or whatever. So that's what makes it successful. Now, the picture behind it just kind of ties into this sense of, I don't even know, like a mad scientist lab where they're brainwashing people or something. So that's kind of how that all fits together. At least that's how I would understand it. Last one, Frida Kahlo. I think we might have looked at this one in the past. If so, I apologize. But this is a painting that she did. It was dealing with helplessness and how she felt disconnected, kind of like emotionally disconnected, but physically, because she had a miscarriage. So it was something that occurred at the Henry Ford Hospital. I don't know exactly where that is. You'd have to do research. But so ironically, she named it Henry Ford Hospital. So if you imagine having a horrible event like that, medical wise, but in this case, a miscarriage, and then it's like you make this emotional painting that's dealing with some of these deep, issues or pains that you have. Where do you get to name it? And you just name it after the hospital. It's an interesting way to do it. Let's see here. There's a couple notes I wanted. So I think you can kind of get the picture's not coded. It's pretty straightforward what the meaning is and what's going on. But one small detail that you wouldn't know unless you dug for it. This painting was the first painting that she used with sheet metal. So that's interesting. Diego Rivera, her husband, who was a really, really famous Mexican artist, and they had kind of a rocky relationship. But Diego Rivera wanted to improve her mood after the miscarriage and encouraged her to try to paint on tin panels. So that was a new thing for her. And so this was actually the first one that she did, and she did quite a bit of that moving forward. So in her painting career, this one's historic because of that reason. Then he always suggested to her that if she was stuck on ideas for painting, that she should paint something about her life. And she had many years of turmoil in her life, so that's usually where those paintings went, in that direction. All right, well, It was a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but there's your last lecture for college art for the year. So hopefully you got it. Hopefully it was fun.